So today we continue to be in the 20th century. A couple of things to finish up with, some doctrines that were developed and changed in the 20th century before moving on into 20th century practice and noting some things about Christianity. So remember the final coming up in 2 weeks. If you have questions about the study guide, by all means get in contact with me. We had talked about some Protestant developments in doctrine last Wednesday, and there's some Catholic developments that I really want to talk about today. One of the major events in Catholic doctrine in the 20th century is the Second Vatican Council, often referred to as Vatican II. And just like there was a lot of diversity and development in Protestantism in the 20th century, Catholicism was undergoing its own kind of questions and reinterpretations. Throughout the early part of the 20th century, if you think back to our discussions of culture and society, we talked about this growing social concern and social activism. Well, that wasn't the only place where there was a lot of conversation within Catholicism about the traditions and the practices. And so there's a lot of discussion among priests, theologians, and even common Catholics about traditional perspectives about faith, doctrine, and the practice of Catholicism. Now, for the first part of the 20th century, a lot of that was muted in Europe especially because of 2 world wars. And so much of Catholic attention in the 20th century in Europe was focused on world wars. And often there was also a disconnect between the Vatican and the practice of American Catholics in both the North and South, North American and South America. In 1958, the Pope at the time, Pius XII, died. He had been Pope for 20 years at the time. And that meant that he had served as a Pope through a large part of the tumultuous period around the middle of the 20th century, so World War II. Well, after the death of the Pope, the cardinals, one of the levels within the hierarchy, gathered together to select a new Pope. Now, ostensibly, what is supposed to happen, or at least what they claim happened, is that through the voting that the cardinals do, God makes his will known as to who the next Pope should be. But there's also evidence that a lot of the personal positions of the cardinals often influence the votes as well. And there have been records of people kind of jockeying for position, right? Individuals that wanted to serve as Pope or had a personal preference about the Pope. One aspect of this earthly attempt to find the Pope is what's known as a caretaker Pope. And it appears that after the death of Pius XII, that the cardinals were looking for a caretaker Pope. A caretaker Pope essentially is an older man who it's believed would be relatively conservative and wouldn't be interested in making a lot of changes. And usually the conception is that this older Pope would serve for just a relatively short amount of time, and after that they would, things would kind of settle down, especially in Europe at the time, and then a younger man could be elected as Pope after the caretaker Pope passed. Well, they certainly got the short part right. That he would be a conservative caretaker Pope, however, was not the case. 90 days after being elected Pope, Angelo Roncalli, who took the papal name John the 23rd, called for an ecumenical council, called for a worldwide council. Now, the last worldwide council in Catholicism had been Vatican I in 1870. And so almost 100 years between the last worldwide council. And it was that worldwide council that we talked about in the 19th century, which had come to the agreement on the doctrine of papal infallibility. Prior to the First Vatican Council was the Council of Trent in the 1500s. So you see, this is not something that frequently occurs. The goal of the council was aggiornamento, an Italian word that means modernization. And so supporters of this idea spoke of opening the doors of the church and sweeping out the accretions of history. The belief was that there were some things that had gotten into Catholicism over its history that needed to be done away with, and things that weren't necessarily scriptural or had the support of apostolic tradition. Furthermore, they also talked about the idea of bringing the church into the 20th century, and so that idea of modernization. Over several years, from 62 to 65, the various meetings covered a variety of topics. They covered things like the liturgy, which is the pattern of worship, how you go through a worship service, the identity of the church, relationship of the church to the world, the relationship of Catholicism with other religions, both Christian and not, ideas of religious freedom. Should the Catholic Church support religious freedom? Even the role of priests and nuns. What role did they have within the church? And so, as you can kind of see, there's this kind of overarching goal of looking at everything within Catholicism and saying, what is part of the doctrine, what has been added to the church, what can be modernized, and what needs to remain traditional. I want to talk about a few examples of the differences or some of the ideas that come out of it based on some documents published within the council. One of the documents that evidences the most changes undergoing in Catholicism is Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. It addresses the style and pattern of worship within Catholicism. The document was released and promulgated on December 4th, 1963, with the provision that the changes that it advocated had to be instituted by the first Sunday of December 1965. So about a 2-year span, certain changes were to be made. Now, this involved the structure of the worship space. Things like where the priest would stand for services. And a large part of the traditional form of the Catholic Mass, the Catholic service, the priest stood with his back to the audience, performing a lot of different actions related to the Eucharist communion that were kind of, the idea was that he was speaking to God on behalf of the church. Well, this often left a lot of the participants, the worshipers, disconnected from what was going on in front. The priest was doing various things before God, but wasn't really connecting with the people. With Sacrosanctum Concilium, the priest now turned and faced the audience and spoke mostly on God's behalf to the people gathered, was the theology behind it. And so that was a major shift that some people liked. They thought it was more participatory now. Other people didn't, because especially older people who had grown up believing that the way the priest should be is turned around speaking to God. Another change advocated in this document was the use of local languages in the service. Up through 1965, a majority of Catholic Mass was done in Latin, as it had been for several centuries. But now it was to be the local language, whether it's English or Spanish or German, wherever the church would be. And then finally, also advocated in the document was an increased level of participation from the audience. Saying and responding certain ways during the Mass, where the priest would say something and then the congregation would respond. people serving as readers of passages from the Bible during the service. So a lot more of a participation on behalf of the audience. And so a lot of changes here with how the worship pattern was structured. Again, some people supported it, thought this was great. Other people did not like it when it was first introduced because they had grown up believing that that was the way you did it and now you're trying to change. In fact, there is a kind of schismatic group of Catholics who have broken off and hold to the form of the Mass that has been in place since the Council of Trent in the 1500s because they don't recognize the authority of this document. Another very important document out of Vatican II is Gaudium et Spes, Joys and Hopes. Essentially, one of the things that was the major change here had to do with the identity of the church. Before this, the main way that a lot of Catholics thought about the church, the concept of the church, the universal church, was through the mystical body of Christ, which essentially was the idea of the universal church is expressed on earth, but you could never be totally sure who was absolutely in and who was out. And so you should treat all people as potentially within the mystical body of Christ. And so, we talked about Dorothy Day as an example of one of those famous Catholics who was very involved in Catholic action. And so she talked about the idea of, she ministered to everyone because she never knew when she was going to be ministering to Christ in disguise, right? The mystical body notion. Coming from Matthew chapter 25, right? I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was naked and you clothed me. And they say, well, when did we see you like this, right? And so that kind of idea. Gaudium et Spes introduced the idea of the pilgrim people of God. This idea of the destination that Catholicism was on. And that also kind of softened the idea of exclusivity. And the Catholic Church, from a long time forward, had emphasized the need to be in the Catholic Church for salvation. Right? There was no salvation outside the Church. But essentially, the pilgrim people of God concept opened the possibility that other people were on the same journey, other Christian groups were on the same journey towards the destination of heaven. Perhaps the greatest document that came out of, greatest in the sense of it had the most impact, that came out of the council was actually a document that didn't quite come out of the council, and that's Humana Vitae. Now, the purpose of Vatican II is all this idea of newness, the nature of the church, renewal, change. And one thing that a lot of Catholics wanted to see changed within the church's dogma was the position of the church on contraception, particularly artificial contraception. We're talking at a time when the birth control pill is really coming into prominence. It hadn't been that prominent before the middle of the 20th century. But Catholic dogma was that the use of artificial means of contraception was a sin. Essentially, the concept of marriage was for procreation. And so every act of sexual intercourse had to be open to the possibility of life being created out of it. And so that's why the only kind of contraception that was used was any sort of natural, right, abstinence. Not having sex during certain times of the month based on a female's cycle. Now, in the 19th century, a lot of Protestants had shared similar opposition to birth control, but by the 20th century, most Protestants had given up any sort of opposition to birth control and instead talked about sex within marriage being for pleasure, for the uniting of husband and wife together, and not just for procreation. By the middle of the 20th century, Episcopalians, for example, approved of the use of the birth control pill. The World Health Organization, the United Nations, We're holding population conferences, right? Really, a lot of people concerned about population. Now, one of the things that was going on in Catholicism is because of the rejection of artificial birth control, there were a lot of Catholic families that had sizable numbers of children, which would cause a financial strain on the family, would cause a variety of psychological pressures for the parents, and sometimes even physical stress on the mother who is giving birth to so many children. But with it being a sin, it was not something taken very lightly. But here are these priests kind of in between. They know the church is teaching that it's sinful, and so they can't budge on that. But they're also seeing the pain of the lives of the people that are coming into their churches, coming in to confess. And so there are records of priests who are hearing quite frequently from people of their use of birth control, which in Catholic eyes is a sin. Now, the other thing with this is that with confession within Catholicism, going to the priest, confessing your sins, the priest goes to God on your behalf, and then usually presented some sort of acts of contrition that you must do, a certain number of prayers, or certain other types of things. But here are the priests who know these people are going to continue to use birth control, so they cannot offer them that forgiveness of sins that was a standard part of confession, because part of the confession and part of the absolution of the sin is you're going to stop doing it. Well, the priests know that these people are not going to stop doing it. So when Vatican II comes up, there's a lot of concern about this issue that's been floating around for a while. So John the 23rd agrees to organize a birth control commission that would participate in Vatican II. In the first version of this commission, there were to be 6 members. 2 of them were to be priests, 2 were to be doctors, 1 to be a sociologist, and 1 to be a demographer. Now, what's part of the reason why this is so much of an issue is questions about how does the pill work? So, the concerns of it is this going to cause an abortion? Is this doctrine an absolute doctrine? And so the commission met early on in this process and encourages that a study should be taken and see what we can discover about the pill and some other things. And no absolute decisions were going to be made. But the idea was that this was going to look at the church's teaching and say, is this one of the places where there needs to be a change? In 1963, John the 23rd died, and the Pope that succeeded him, Paul VI, continued to move forward the entirety of the Second Vatican Council, but also the Birth Control Commission, and appointed 7 more members, 5 of them priests, to the commission. But one of the things coming out of the commission's meetings is that they seem reluctant to condemn the pill. And so there's some opportunity here that maybe some changes are going to be made. Possibly that what had seemed a closed question was an open-ended question. Well, the commission itself, who at this point is now heavily priests, right? Males who are not married, who probably have never had children, are the ones making these decisions. And so the commission says, we need to have more people on here with some experience. Particularly, we need more women, and we need to have married people. And so Paul VI appoints 43 new members, 34 of them common people, 3 of them married couples, 3 married couples, and 5 women. And one of the things the Pope seems to indicate is that it's very important to hear what their experience is. Paul VI interviews with a journalist and expresses some doubt about the church's views on the pill. Well, one of the things that is going on in all of this is this concern over, is this church teaching or not? But eventually, Paul VI pulls out the Commission on Birth Control out of Vatican II. And so that's not one of the main things decided then. In 1966, the Vatican begins to pressure the Commission to make a decision. But what seems to be the case is that the Commission only the 16 bishops and cardinals would be allowed to vote. The one that didn't vote was a bishop from Poland named Karol Wojtyla, who would eventually become John Paul II. He was in Poland, and Poland was a communist country at the time, so he couldn't get to the vote. In 1966, a variety of reports were issued. And on the question of, is contraception intrinsically evil? 9 of the bishops voted no, it is not intrinsically evil. 3 of them voted yes, and 3 of them abstained. The reports leaked in 1967, and this begins to cause some confusion. The majority opinion appears to be you could use the pill, and so people felt this is going to be the ultimate decision. The majority in the report said it was up to the personal responsibility of each individual. He admitted